The architecture vision phase is the first phase of the architecture development method. This phase is undertaken based on the consensus arrived as well as based on the outcomes and findings of the preliminary phase. The objectives of this phase are essentially twofold. One, to crystallize the architecture vision which began taking shape in the preliminary phase, and secondly, to obtain organizational buy-in required to move ahead with the proposed architecture development work. So, working towards these objectives, the overall approach in this phase is focused on crystallizing the architecture vision. What we mean by that is, in this phase, architects perform deeper analysis to essentially validate the business context and the drivers identified earlier in the preliminary phase. This involves working on 5 key areas. First, to establish the true value proposition of the change. Secondly, demonstrating how the proposed architecture work would be able to meet these expectations. And third, identifying risks, unknowns, issues, and assumptions that are at play, and identifying how some or all of these may be mitigated. And fourth is clarifying the constraints within which the architecture development effort will occur. These are typically guided by architecture and business principles that were identified earlier in the preliminary phase, as well as existing investments on technology, applications, skill sets, as well as strategic, tactical, and operational drivers, financial constraints, and so forth. Now, much of the 4 points discussed so far are focused on business value, feasibility, and viability of the proposed change. However, it is also vitally important to establish the business readiness for the proposed change or transformation. That is, it explores the desirability of these changes from the point of view of organizational preparedness by also bringing into focus cultural, moral, regulatory, and ethical perspectives. Now, these kinds of analysis and findings have influence of refining and clarifying the scope, the enterprise-wide impact of the proposed change, and consequently the stakeholder engagements required. They also lead to further refinement of the high-level baseline and target architecture views that were identified earlier. This leads to further clarity on the specific architectural building blocks or capabilities that need to be built, bought, enhanced, replaced, or deprecated in order to address the gap that exists between the identified baseline and target state. This phase also focuses on the identification of success criteria, metrics, and the KPI to track progress and measure benefits realization. Based on these information, we create an architecture vision and statement of architecture work, which are the 2 deliverables of this phase, which will be used to drive consensus, obtain stakeholder endorsements, and buy-in and funding required to proceed with the architecture development.